All right, so let's talk one more time here. I'd like to look at this discussion. I've had this topic going on for a while now about why the Ninja 300 is a piece of crap. And I'd like to sort of move on. And the last time I looked at this, I got bogged down in gearing and rotational inertia and so forth, trying to do some actual calculations of the actual acceleration of the bike. And I think I got a little bit too bogged down. And I'd like to go back and take another look at this, but make some simplifying assumptions. So I think we're all familiar pretty much by now with the dyno chart for the Ninja 300, which shows a peak torque of about 18 foot-pounds at around 11,000 RPM and a horsepower peak of just about 35 horsepower at roughly the same RPM. So keeping that in mind, I think the thing I did the last time, like I said, was got bogged down in gearing and going to Gearing Commander and pulling down the gear ratios and trying to calculate rotational inertia from the wheels and the tires mass and tire diameter and using the gearing and so forth. And I realized that wasn't really necessary. If you think about most of the bikes that people are interested in buying, who would consider buying a Ninja 300, they're roughly the same weight. They're not much more than the 385 pounds wet that the Ninja 300 is. The wheels and tires are not different in size. They might be wider, they might be slightly heavier, but not so much so as to make a huge difference. The bike themselves are not that much heavier. Someone who's considering buying a 385 pound bike is not going to be really considering buying a 550 or 600 pound bike. But in any case, even if they are considering it, the physics that I'm going to look at, the level I'm looking at here, really don't change. What I'd like to do is basically make a simplifying assumption that the bike weighs 450 pounds wet, and the rider is the same weight, and the wheels and tires are all the same weight and diameter and have the same rotational inertia, and ignore all the actual details of the gearing and just focus on what the bike's actual road speed is as a function of RPM in each gear, and assume the wheel diameter is 2 feet so that the radius is 1 foot, so that once you know the torque at the rear wheel from the dyno chart, all you need to do is take out the length measurement and you can figure out what the pounds thrust on the bike and rider is going to be just from the torque. So let's look at what I'd like to start here as an example here is looking at, like I said, the dyno chart for certain particular bikes, and looking at the gearing as a function of speed, and looking at the acceleration in pounds thrust for specific bikes, going from the most powerful sports bikes on the market to the least powerful sport bike on the market, which, if not quite the Ninja 300, is pretty damn close in the CR250. We're not even going to go there. We're going to just stop at the Ninja 300. And let's just see what is happening in terms of the numbers. Again, not talking about which bike is too powerful or not powerful enough or whatever. Not talking about which bike handles too well or not well enough or whatever. Not talking about which bike is too expensive or not expensive enough or not really good buy. Which bike is a good starter bike. Which bike is a good first bike. Not talking about any of that. Just focusing on the acceleration based on the torque of the bike at a certain speed, and looking at the speed and gear, centric performance of these bikes. The other stuff we will leave to future videos on what's a good starter bike, what's a good first bike, how does the handling of the bike change as a function of wheelbase and bike weight. What can you really expect to do with a motorcycle in terms of loading it for trips and things like that? And how does that affect the performance? All these things I'll leave to another video on those topics, on starter bikes, first bikes, and on handling as a function of weight and wheelbase. For right now, let's just look at the power and what its effect is, the gearing and what its effect is, assuming the bikes pretty much weigh all about the same. and that they're physically, geometry-wise, about the same, which they are in this case. They really are pretty close. All right, so first up is the Ducati 1299 Panigale. Just about the most powerful bike you can buy, sport bike you can buy these days. You can see here that the torque curve in red on the top here has two peaks, and the first peak is at roughly 2,000, 3,000 RPM, which is right off idle. And the second peak is around between 8 and 10,000 RPM. The red line of about 11,000 RPM. And you see the measured peak there is given in the second chart, which I've already put into road speed, at about 95 foot-pounds at 9K. So this tells us a few things. One of the things it tells us is that the peak of the power band is up near the top of the RPM range, which means this bike is very cammy. Especially with that peak in the middle, you can say that it's very cammy. Usually cammy engines will have a hot low end and a hot high end and a noticeable notch in the middle. And in this case, that second peak is coming up here, up near the RPM limit, and what that's telling us that the bike is going to have a sort of a mellow but strong rush up towards the top of the RPM band. Though in this case, having that peak at the low end also means that it'll have a fairly good pull at around 3,000 RPM, which is generally the case with these Ducati L Twins. They don't really like to rev below 3,000 RPM. They pull acceptably away from 3,000 RPM, kind of coast through that mid-range, and then come on strong up near the top of the RPM band. Very characteristic of this bike. This torque curve is easily recognized and practiced by anyone who's actually ridden these bikes. And in this case, we see that road speed at 9K in first gear is about 50, 60 miles an hour, between 55 and 65 miles an hour, and that's a good number. That means that the bike will run very strongly up to 65 miles an hour in first gear, 71 miles an hour in first gear is the top of the power band. That's not bad at all for American riders. That's nice, strong first gear performance, but not ridiculous. Also, the peak down at 3,000 RPM happens at about 20 miles an hour in first gear, which means the bike will require a little bit of clutch slipping to get off the line, but not too much. 20 miles an hour at 3,000 RPM, that's a number you want to keep in mind going forward here. Okay, let's look at a bike that's a little bit more moderate, like the FC1. Here it has a nice, smooth, broad torque curve, peaking at about 8,000 RPM. Let's see here, I've got here on this other sheet, it says 8,000 RPMs, but only 67 foot-pounds, so that's down about 25% down from the Panigale. The bike's going to be slightly heavier than the Panigale, but not so much heavier that it makes a huge difference. So looking again at the road speed here, we can see that the 8K is about 2K down from 3K down from the red line, so it's going to roll off slightly as it approaches red line, but it'll have a nice big fat wide power band up to 8K, and 8K is right there at 60 miles an hour in first gear. We go back and we look at around 3,000 RPM, and that's going to be again around 20 miles an hour in first gear. These are, again, good numbers. Again, the bike requires a little bit of slippage to get off the line. Not much. It's not going to bog down nearly as much as the Panigale does because the torque curve doesn't roll off as much around 3K, but it's still going to be moderately accelerating as it approaches red line, although not quite as strongly as the Panigale. And again, looking at that 67 foot-pounds number, we expect about 65 foot-pounds of thrust as it approaches, 65 pound of thrust as it approaches the 8K red line. So it should perform well and strongly, but not quite as aggressive as the Panigale as it approaches that 8K peak at here. We see that is going to be at about 60 miles an hour. And so it's going to have a little bit longer legs than the Panigale 1299, but not accelerate quite as strongly. So this is a step down in terms of performance, but more of a step up in terms of roadability, let's put it that way, than the Panigale is. The 1299 will be. All right, looking at the ZX-10R, I'll spare you the torque curve. This is much more peaky torque curve, just looking at the road speed versus torque here. 75 foot-pounds at 11K means that power band is going to come on strong as it approaches the red line. The 13K red line in a bike with an engine that's about 1 liter means that this bike is going to be somewhat more expensive, because to have the engine spin that fast, you're going to have to use more expensive components in the engine. So it'll be a somewhat peaky bike, which as a sport bike is not completely unexpected. And at 11K, the bike is pulling about 85 miles an hour, which is definitely fast for a road bike. This bike will go very quickly in first gear for compared to much more average bikes like the FC1. Let's see where 20 mile an hour is. 20 mile an hour is down about 2,600 RPM, which is good. Not too bad off the line. Not requiring too much clutch slip for it's off the line, but requiring some. And it'll basically pull somewhat weakly but linearly as it approaches that 11K power peak, at which point it is going quite fast and still accelerating strongly. But that's what you expect from a good leader bike. This is completely characteristic of a good leader bike. And whether that's more than you need or not, that's something we won't get into right now. I just wanted to point out the numbers. 75 pounds of force accelerating the rider in the bike at 11K at about 85 miles an hour. All right, so we're going to redo the Panigale 899 chart, and popping it up here, we can see that the Panigale 899 has a torque peak of about 65 foot-pounds at 10K. Its characteristics are very similar, not quite as extreme, but similar to the 1299, 1199 Panigale, with two lobes, one lobe centering down at about 3,000 RPM, 3,500 RPM, and another lobe up near the higher end of the RPM band, as you can see here at 10K. So what I think, this certainly does not have the extremes in the torque curve that the 1299 has, but what you still see here is that 65 foot-pounds at 10K, which is right up near the power band, certainly indicates a flatter power band than the extreme of the 1299. But you're still going to have some torque drop below 3K, and certainly with this 899, having been out on demo rides on this bike before, I can tell you one of the things about it. It's an easy bike to stall, and a lot of guys that I saw on these demo rides with the 899 would stall it at lights, so no question it has to be revved up to around 3K to really get off the line with it. And you'll see here that at 10K, that 65 pounds of thrust on that rider is going to be hitting you hardest at about 63 miles an hour in first gear. 20 miles an hour on this bike is around 3,300 RPM. Again, it's pretty standard. Not unusual. The bike has, I think, slightly above average power for a sport bike. In the 600 cc to 750 range, slightly above power for that range, but not excessive power. It's certainly easy enough to manage for someone with any decent experience, but not overpowering or overpowering fast. But I would say that's the case for pretty much all the Panigales. The fact that they're geared so short is really an advantage for them. They're easy enough to ride through first gear. The bikes will definitely move, but they're not going to get you going so fast in first gear that you're going to get into outrageous amounts of trouble. And certainly, you have to, I think, keep in mind with these bikes that they're really geared short, and they may seem to accelerate well in first gear, but when you get through first gear, you're not going as fast as you would be with some other sport bikes, certainly. So let's move on to, okay, next up we have the FC9, Yamaha's new FC9, which is a well-received bike. It is a triple as opposed to an inline four. And with the torque peak at 60 foot-pounds at 8,300 RPM, it's very similar, slightly less powerful, but more similar to the FC1. Power coming in at the same RPM at the peak, but we can see the peak is going to be slightly higher, not significantly higher. The main thing is it's going to be at only 40 miles an hour as opposed to 60 miles an hour. And that is going to have a significant difference. The bike is going to be seen to be geared a lot shorter, than the FC1 is. It's going to require somewhat less slippage off the line, but it's going to race through first gear compared to the FC1, and certainly compared to the ZX-10R and the 1299 Panigale. So the question becomes, is it too short, just right, or too long? I think from experience, that bike is pretty mellow. I think even for that power level, I would call it a good, solid, but still kind of mellow power delivery, nice and smooth and linear. I certainly wouldn't call this bike overpowering in any way, although some might. But I think a fairly experienced rider can handle this bike no problem at full throttle in first gear. And all right, so now we're looking at the FC7. And the FC7 is a pretty extreme case here. Here we have the torque peak at 6,500 RPM, which is, as you have probably recognized now, pretty low. And so that the peak torque is hitting you, according to this chart, first gear is hitting you at about 32 miles an hour, which is definitely the lowest of the ones we've looked at so far. And I found this bike to be geared exceptionally short, has a very narrow sort of torque window between about 4,000 and 7,000, maybe 8,000 RPM, where it accelerates very decently, but still, it's still somewhat weaker than the average 700, 750, and it's certainly geared short. There's no question about it. 20 mile an hour on this bike is going to be close to about 4,000 RPM, which is certainly high, certainly a short gearing, and top RPM in first gear, 45 miles an hour. That's half of what you would see with the ZX-10R, no question about it. Even though that would occur at something like 12,000 RPM in first gear in the ZX-10R. It's certainly 20 mile an hour down on what you'd see on the Panigale 899, even if that is at 10K versus 9K. There's no question that this bike is geared much shorter, and the power comes on stronger and drops off much more quickly than most other bikes. Although it does have decent power in that power band and accelerates well, this bike is much more of a 300 or 400 type bike, I think, than it is a 600 or 750. Even though it's called a 700, it really has more like 500, 400-ish power. But there you see it right there, 45 pounds of thrust at 6,500 RPM. No question about it. A capable but somewhat underpowered bike. All right, so now we move into the soon-to-be Street Fighter class. Not too long after being purchased, the 600 Super Sports, such as the gsx-r, Gixxer 600, R6. The 6R is probably middle of the road in that regard in terms of its peakiness, but still you see here the torque peak is at 12K. 14K RPM red line means this bike is going to be very expensive for its displacement. And the R6 is even higher on RPM. This is a $15,000 bike, a 600. Certainly not a very good cost per performance ratio, but one of the better, if not the best, 600s. Let's look at the numbers here. We have 12K 45. That's going to be a soft mid-range up to a strong high-end, so come in pretty strong as it approaches that high-end, approaches red line. 20 miles an hour, we see down here somewhere around 30, maybe 4,000 RPM. A little high, but not too high, so it's going to require, again, some slippage, but not too bad. And it'll be pretty soft at the low end here, between 4,000 and 7,000 RPM, and then come on gradually and come on strong as it gets to about 9, 11, 12,000 RPM. So the thing about that is the bikes that have that soft low end and mid range, obviously, while they may put out large horsepower numbers as they spin really high, they're still going to be pretty tame, even tepid, between getting on the throttle at 3,000 RPM and running it up to about 9,000, where the torque peak starts to come. And they're going to have two different characters. They're going to be very mellow, very soft at the middle to low range, and very strong as they approach that power band. Again, we're going to avoid talking about whether this is good or bad for anyone. We just want to point out the characteristics, and let's stick to the numbers for right now. 45 pounds of thrust as it approaches 10K, 12K, certainly much less power than that, much less acceleration than that at the lower end of the power band. The one thing that's outstanding about this bike is geared so long in a 6th gear, 155 miles an hour. I really doubt this bike will hit 155 miles an hour. It probably will top at more like 125. Just doesn't have the horsepower to do more than 125. And in 6th gear, 65 miles an hour comes in about 6,000 RPM, which is definitely something I've noticed myself riding this bike, no question about it. So I would say there's about a 600 Super Sport. You're looking at about 5,000 to 6,000 RPM at 65 miles an hour, somewhere in around 75, just under 7,000. Again, below the power band, requiring a kick down in gear, at least 1 or 2 to get any real acceleration. Even at 75 miles an hour, you're looking at having to drop down to maybe 4th before you can get anything going with this bike, even at 75 miles an hour in terms of a roll-on. So again, characteristic here of the 600s, I would say super sports, very mellow in the low to mid-range, requiring a downshift or 2, maybe even 3 to get any real acceleration at highway speeds, but coming on strong as they approach the red line, and still having, I would say, almost half the thrust of a leader bike, and until they get right near the power band. Near the top of the power band, they might be about 75 to 80% of what you'd see out of a leader bike, but below that, they're well below leader bike in power in the mid range to low end, and certainly not overpowering in any way in the low to mid range of the power band. That's the gsx-r. Let's go to the next bike. Okay, so now here we have the FZ6R, which is a quote-unquote standard / sport bike that Yamaha's been selling for quite a while. Long time. Been making a lot of evolution, a lot of changes to the bike over the years. Many years they've been making this bike. Here it's down to 40, which is easily 10 to 15% down compared to the ZX6R in terms of peak power, peak thrust, and then 8K versus 10 to 12K, again down significantly in terms of the power torque peak, and that peak is going to be at about 40 miles an hour. Way down, but still 40 miles an hour is where we saw interesting numbers for, say, the FC9 and the FC7, but still this bike will go faster in first gear than the FC7 by quite a bit. It will rev higher, it has a broader power band, and it certainly is making comparable peak power to the FC7. The bike weighs a little bit more, and certainly it's a little bit more expensive than the FC7, but it certainly has a broader power band and a little bit more legs. 20 miles an hour is up at 4,500 RPM. So at low speeds, this bike is easy to get off the line. You see at 2,400 RPM, it's down only 11. Very easy to get off the line, very easy to ride, very rideable. Yet with certainly a broader power band than some contemporary triples, and certainly more of a leader bike like, or mid sort of, I would say, standard leader bike as opposed to sport bike, super bike, like in power band, more like the FC1 than the ZX10, but with about 2/3 of the thrust. So not a bad bike at all. And obviously with less of a reputation for danger than, say, the R6, which is just a completely different approach to a motorcycle, which is much faster handling, much less stable, and a much peakier power band than the FC6R. I didn't even bother to put the R6 in. It's such an extreme, and the ZX6R was certainly enough to demonstrate the difference. But let's go to the next and last bike. Okay, so the next and last bike here is the Ninja 300, our quote-unquote hero. And here you see that peak. It's I put it in as 20 foot-pounds at 10K. It's really 18. It's not even 20. Peaking up way, almost at the red line, which means it's going to be very soft off vital, very soft through the mid-range, and only coming up with some power as it approaches maybe 7 to 8K, 9K, 10K. It is called a Ninja, and it's called a Ninja for a reason. The power band is very similar to the other Ninjas. It just has far less power, and 20 pounds of thrust on a bike that's almost 400 pounds compared to 45 and 65 pounds of thrust on the bike that's on bikes that are 435. Basically, the 6R and the 10R are both about 435 pounds. Obviously it's going to be significantly less acceleration. If the gearing was the same, but the gearing is nowhere near the same. The gearing here, as you can see, 32 miles an hour in first gear at the red line. I mean, it's just, ridiculously low. And 20 miles an hour is, 7,000 RPM. 3,000, 2,000 RPM is in single digits. I mean, this bike is geared very, very short and still has no power. And it's not that light compared to other bikes. I'll leave you to draw conclusions about how well it accelerates from that. And like the other conclusions, we will talk about them in another video. The highest speed that you'll see on this bike is roughly 102, maybe 105 if you slightly over rev it. 65 miles an hour, you're looking at somewhere around 66 to 700 RPM, 7,000 RPM. Dropping it down a gear doesn't help you because it just slows the bike down, and then you have to reaccelerate back to the speed you were going originally, and you just really don't have much to play with. The best thing to do with this bike in terms of accelerating it at highway speeds is to, I don't know, maybe drop it down a gear and just open the throttle and just hope that at some point you actually start going faster. The bike will do 100 miles an hour, certainly. It's just a question of how much time you have to get it up to that speed. But the real question is, riding it at between 65 and say 85 miles an hour, which I think is more reasonable, more common. To even get it to 80 miles an hour, you have to be in fifth. You have to be almost in the center of the power band. You're right over in the very extreme right lower corner of the speed range. If this bike is going to be ridden on the highway, it is clearly, the gears are just long enough, combined with the fact that it has 6 gears, just long enough to allow it to be ridden at highway speeds. And even then it's in the center of the power band. You really can't, miss the point here that it just doesn't have that much acceleration on tap once you get it up to road speeds. And you'd have to run it through first and well into second gear to even get it up to 45 miles an hour. Getting it to 60 miles an hour, you'd have to run it up in the fourth. And that is, again, there's something we're going to draw conclusions from. It's something we're just going to state as fact, and we'll move on to our next video. We start talking about suitability for various roles, and also about the impact, the benefits and the detriments of the wheelbase, 55-inch wheelbase, and the 385, 395 pound curb weight of this bike, wet weight of this bike, and exactly what are the pluses and minuses in terms of handling relative to the other bikes that we've talked about here. For now, we'll just leave it at that, and I'll show you the dyno curves just so you don't have to go fishing on the internet for them. I have them on this video.